Rain thudded softly against the cobbled street outside the Grand Music Hall on Featherstone Lane. Inside, velvet curtains hung heavy in the dim, echoing silence of the rehearsal room. It was a silence that did not belong. Not in this place. Not on the night before Arthur Grange was set to perform what was to be his farewell concert, his last bow after 5 decades of genius, storm, and scandal. And yet the silence lingered, long after the last note should have died away. Detective Inspector Braddon paused in the threshold, taking in the confusion painted across the faces of those assembled. Lady Margaret Chudleigh, patroness of the arts, clutching her opera glasses as if they might provide clarity. The hall's manager, Hargrove, pale and stammering. The young understudy, Vincent Lee, his fingers trembling against the polished wood of his viola. In the center of the room stood an empty violin case, its plush interior dark and hollow, like a mouth open in horror. The violin was gone. Not just any violin, but the Il Canone, the Canon Garnerius of 1743, loaned by a reclusive Italian collector for this one historic performance. Its insurance valuation alone could have bought a manor house, and yet it had vanished sometime between the end of the afternoon rehearsal and the arrival of the constables an hour later. Braddon knelt by the case. There was no sign of forced entry to the room, no broken lock, no jimmied hinge. The doors had been locked from within, according to the night porter, who swore by his dead mother's grave that he had stood watch outside the hall from dusk onward and seen not a soul enter. The windows were barred. The rehearsal room, then, was a locked box, its secret tucked tight inside, and only one thing missing. But there was a clue, if it could be called that. Braddon tilted the object gently in his gloved hand, a folded square of manuscript paper placed inside the violin case. On it, written in a slashing, furious hand, was a single phrase: "Silent strings sing louder." A cipher, a joke, a protest. The note bore no signature, no fingerprint, nothing but a faint scent of camphor and the sharp, clean smear of fresh ink. No ransom note, no demands, said Hargrove, wringing his hands beside the detective. No indication that the instrument was taken for profit, its madness, or performance. Braddon muttered, eyes scanning the room again. Perhaps this is part of a larger composition, something with a darker rhythm. The evening grew. Longer interviews followed, methodical, tedious. But Braddon knew the devil often crouched in the details. Vincent Lee, the understudy, had been the last to see the instrument before it vanished. He'd watched Grange pack it away, snapped the clasps shut himself, and left the room just before 5. "I returned at 6, Lee said, voice cracking under the weight of the moment. Grange had already gone. I came back to run the Mozart. Alone. The case was there, but light somehow. I opened it, and he shook his head. The memory clearly haunted him. Braddon eyed him closely. You were his understudy, with a career in his shadow. Is that not motive enough? I worshipped him, Lee said flatly. He called me his echo. The phrase stuck with Braddon. An echo, like a second violin mimicking, never quite leading. Grange himself was missing. That was the other half of the mystery, the greater half. Not just the violin had vanished. The man who played it had as well. No messages. Braddon asked. Lady Chudleigh sniffed. Arthur sent word by courier just before rehearsal ended, said he felt unwell and would rest in his dressing room before leaving. But he never came out, and his valet swears he never went home. Braddon requested the dressing room opened. Nothing out of place, though the mirror had been wiped clean, oddly enough. No prints, no smudges. Just a faint imprint where a cloth had moved in slow, deliberate arcs on the dressing table. A handwritten list, pieces to be performed, scrawled at the top. A note in Grange's unmistakable hand. Every note I ever played lives in that violin. Without it, I am only silence. Braddon stared. 2 messages. One in the case, one here. Both speaking of sound and silence. It was then the constable returned from the alley with a third curiosity. A witness, sir. Bit of a tramp, but sharp. Said he saw something strange behind the hall just after 6. The old man, wearing a torn Mackinaw gaze like a startled owl, nodded emphatically when questioned. Tall man, moved fast, coat too long, like a cape. He came out the fire escape. I heard a low note like a cello or something, and then he was gone. But there is no cello. Breton said, "Not in this concert." "I know what I heard," the man grunted. "It hummed through the wall, like thunder rolled up tight." Back in the hall, Breton asked for the floor plans. There was one thing odd about the rehearsal room, something unnoticed in the day's chaos. A storage chamber behind the east wall, sealed decades ago. No longer in use. It had once been for instrument. Crates, connected by a dumbwaiter to the backstage area. "And where does that dumbwaiter open?" Breton asked. "Backstage," said Hargrove, "beside the prop alcove." "But it's boarded now, been unused since the war." "Boarded," Breton echoed. "But still there." When they pried it open, the answer came not in noise, but in the shape of absence. The interior of the shaft was slick with recent scuff marks, thus disturbed. A narrow handprint on the inside of the wood panel. Someone had lowered themselves down, inch by inch, holding the violin close. And at the bottom, just outside the shaft's opening, was the missing thing no one had thought to check for: Arthur Grange's coat. Folded, neat, like the man had shed a skin. No blood, no body. Just the echo of a life, and the ghost of a final performance that never played. Breton stood silent beside the open dumbwaiter shaft, staring into its dusty gullet. The coat told him one thing clearly: Arthur Grange had removed it deliberately, folded it with the same care he gave to his crescendo. It was not the discard of a panicked fugitive. No, this was planned, intentional. But why disappear? And why abandon the very instrument he had spent a lifetime protecting? As the constables began a search of the lower floor, following the shaft's trajectory to the understage passage, Breton stepped back into the rehearsal room. The others still lingered. Their anxiety curdled now into silence. Vincent Lee leaned against the far wall, his bow hand twitching in slow, rhythmic spasms. Lady Chudleigh paced, muttering to herself, while Hargrove busied himself with utterly pointless rearrangements of furniture. It was then Breton caught it, a smell, faint, sour, metallic. It didn't belong. He followed it with the sharp instinct of someone used to finding needles in very large haystacks. It grew stronger near the music stands. Kneeling, he ran a finger across the underside of one stand and brought it to his nose. Rosin, no surprise there. But beneath that, wax, furniture wax, and something else, a trace of brass polish. He looked again. One of the screws securing the base of the stand had been replaced, newer, shinier than the others. Odd, not conclusive, but odd, still on the floor. Breton's eyes fell on a fragment beside the stand's base, barely visible against the wood, a tiny shaving of dark varnish, curling like the skin of an apple. He pocketed it silently. Returning to his feet, he turned to Lee, whose eyes were now locked not on the case, nor the shaft, but the spot where the folded coat had been laid out minutes earlier. There was something haunted about his stare. "Tell me again," Breton said casually, "why you returned at 6. Lee blinked, as if waking. "To rehearse." "I told you. I thought Arthur had gone. But the note said he was staying to rest. Surely you expected him to still be here?" I thought perhaps he'd left quickly. He often left without a word." Lee's fingers tightened around the neck of his viola. "Yet you weren't surprised the case was here, unattended, unlocked." "I didn't say unlocked. You said you opened it." Lee flushed. "Out of instinct, I suppose. I was curious." Breton's eyes didn't blink. "Curiosity," he said softly, "can sometimes be mistaken for rehearsal." Behind them, a constable returned, slightly out of breath. "Sir, the passage below leads to the old prop storage. We found fresh prints and something else." They descended together. The chamber was low-ceilinged, lit only by the officer's torch. Dust lay thick on the floor except in a path that led from the shaft's end to a pair of metal cases stacked against the rear wall. Breton moved to them, brushing one open with his sleeve. Inside, padded silk, empty, but lined for, yes, a cello. "Where's this from?" Breton asked. Hargrove had followed them down. Flustered, "That's odd. We haven't had a cello soloist in over a year. That case should have been cleared long ago. And yet," Breton said, "someone recently accessed it, used it, perhaps. The brass polish, the wax, the varnish shaving, and the old tramp's words. I heard a low note, like a cello, Back in the rehearsal room, Braden asked to see the hall's log of deliveries and maintenance, something everyone else had considered beneath their attention. A slim ledger was produced. Most entries were standard: tuning visits, floral deliveries, scheduled rehearsals. But one caught his eye 3 days prior. A crate marked lighting components had been delivered via rear access and signed for not by staff, but by someone using the alias R. Fenlow. "Do we employ a Fenlow?" he asked Hargrove. "No, never heard of the name. A pseudonym. That crate large enough to conceal something, or someone, or something valuable." "What happened to the crate?" We broke it down for firewood. In the basement furnace, which you should show me. Now." The furnace room reeked of old coal and engine oil. Piled to one side were the remnants of the crate: splinters, nails, a half-burnt label still attached to one piece. It read fragile strings in ornate script. "Lighting components," Braden said grimly. "A lie. This crate was designed for a string instrument. Something of value was smuggled in or out either way. Deception wrapped in packaging." They climbed back upstairs, where Lady Chudla now sat with an expression both perturbed and fascinated. "I must say," she intoned, "you do have the gift for dark revelation." "Do you think Arthur staged this?" "I don't know yet," Braden replied. "But someone did. Someone who understood the hall's logistics and Arthur's habits." He glanced again at Lee. "And someone who could mimic the master, if needed." The younger man tensed. "What do you mean?" "You're his echo, you said. Could you have pressed play his repertoire?" Well, yes. I've studied every movement of his bowing. And his posture, his silhouette." Lee looked, puzzled, then defensive. "I don't know where this is going." "It's going," Braden said, turning toward the door, "to the one place no one's yet considered: the stage, the performance archive." The archive was on the upper floor, a long corridor of meticulously kept records, program leaflets, and hundreds of hours of recorded rehearsal footage. Braden requested the last 3 days' security footage from the rehearsal hall. The manager balked. "That's not standard procedure." "Then it's especially valuable." A dusty terminal was located and activated. The images were grainy, flickering but clear enough. Footage rolled. There was Arthur, gesturing at the orchestra. There was Lee. There was Hargrove. And then, something strange. A brief flicker, barely a frame but unmistakable. A man in a long black coat, carrying what looked very much like a cello case. The timestamp: 1 hour after Arthur Grange had supposedly vanished. Braden froze the frame, leaning closer. The silhouette tall, upright, but the posture wrong. Too rigid. Not Arthur's fluid grace. Someone imitating him, or perhaps, "Get me that footage," Braden said, voice low. "And prepare the performance chamber." "For what?" "A private recital," he said. "One that may end in unmasking a ghost." The rehearsal room had emptied for the night. The constables had cordoned off the performance hall. Only a few key figures remained, now seated in the smaller drawing room behind the main stage. Its walls lined with faded portraits of musicians long dead, their painted eyes seeming to watch the proceedings with spectral judgment. Detective Inspector Braden sat with a notepad. Though he rarely glanced at it, he preferred watching faces, not words. Lady Margaret Chudla was the first to be questioned properly. She sat upright, her gloved hands folded in her lap, chin tilted with the precision of old aristocracy. "You've been Arthur's patron for years," Braden began. "Surely you'd recognize any unusual behavior." "Arthur always behaved unusually," she replied with a faint, bitter smile. "Genius walks strangely. But if you mean recently, no. He was introspective, nervous. He took too long silences between rehearsals. At first I thought it was the strain of farewell. Farewell to music, to life." Her voice cracked, just slightly. He had spoken once or twice of ending things on his own terms. He detested decay. "Inspector, you thought he meant to harm himself." "Not necessarily. But something weighed on him." Braden studied her. "You were close to him." She stiffened delicately. "We were close in years past, but no longer." He withdrew. "There were rumors of debts, of illness. I stayed out of it." "Did he trust anyone?" "Even toward the end." She hesitated. "He trusted something. The violin. He called it his soul, Losing it would be worse than death. That was the second person who had linked the instrument to his identity, and the second to suggest that Grange might have orchestrated his own disappearance. Braden made a mental note. Then, gently, "Did you know a Mr. Fenlow?" She looked genuinely puzzled. "No. Should I? Perhaps not." "Thank you." As she left, Vincent Lee was ushered in again. This time, he looked less nervous, more focused, almost rehearsed. Braden leaned forward. "Mr. Lee, I'd like to clarify your timeline." Lee nodded quickly. "Of course, you say you left at 5. "Yes, the rehearsal ended at 10 to. I packed my viola and left the hall. I didn't speak to anyone after." "And when did you return?" "Around 6. Give or take a few minutes. I entered via the side door." "No one saw you?" "I don't think so." "That's convenient." Lee's mouth twitched. "Do you suspect me, Inspector?" "I suspect a great many things. I'm only trying to narrow them." He let the pause linger. "Tell me, if someone were to imitate Grange, to slip out dressed, like him with the violin in tow, who would be capable of mimicking his posture, his walk?" Lee didn't answer immediately. "I could, but so could half the students in the academy. We all studied him. He looked away. "I only wanted to play, just once, on that stage. And now you may get the chance," Braden said flatly. "If he doesn't return, someone will need to replace him. I didn't do this to be promoted." Lee said, voice low. "I wouldn't dare. Maybe not. But ambition wears many disguises." Braden looked at him sharply. "Did Arthur ever ask you to do something unusual?" "No." "Did you ever hear him speak of anyone called Fenlow?" "No." But this time, his eye flicked left. A brief, involuntary tell. Braden noted it. After Lee, the hall manager Hargrove was brought in. He was sweating now, despite the room's cold. "You said you were here during the entire rehearsal." Braden began. "I was in the office, handling paperwork. You signed off on a delivery 3 days ago, under the name R. Fenlow. I didn't realize it was just another delivery. I thought it was lighting parts. They're always labeled oddly. You accepted it without verifying." The crate looked harmless. "What happened to it?" "I passed it to the backstage crew. I assumed it was dealt with. I didn't know it had anything to do with the violin." "Did Grange mention it?" "No." "Did anyone seem particularly interested in that crate?" Hargrove hesitated. "There was a young woman asking about backstage access 2 days ago. Said she was with the media, but she had no ID, so I turned her away." Braden leaned forward. "Describe her." "Short, dark hair, Eastern European accent, maybe." She was quite determined. When I said no, she lingered outside for a bit. No one else had mentioned her, and she hadn't returned, at least not openly. "Could she have been connected to Arthur?" "I don't know. She asked specifically about him. Wanted to know if he had special access to any storage areas." The detective's thoughts turned. A woman posing as press, a mysterious delivery, a burned crate, a man vanishing into thin air, and a cello case carried by someone not quite right. He stood. "Thank you." "One more question. Who had access to the security recordings?" "All the senior staff. Myself. And Lady Chudla, I suppose, in theory." Vincent Lee Tui's handled technical systems before, so all 3 could have edited the footage, or known when it was not recording. Back in the empty rehearsal room, Braden turned off the lights and sat. The darkness cleared his mind. 3 people, each presenting plausible versions of events, and each one hiding something. Lady Chudley's grief was real but selective. She had history with Arthur and motive to protect his memory, or perhaps conceal his final decision. Lee's ambition was cloaked in devotion, but his lie about not knowing the name Fenlow stood out like a sour note. And Hargrove seemed simply out of his depth. Or perhaps he'd simply taken a bribe. The contradictions were small, but they were there. Grange was not just missing. He had engineered something theatrical. Vanishing with his violin, a symbol, not a theft. A transformation, perhaps. But there was still the cello case. And that odd phrase, "silent strings sing louder." It echoed now, not a metaphor, a direction, a cue. Braden stood slowly, the beginnings of a theory stirring behind his eyes. He would need to hear from the violin itself. If it could be found, The early morning light began to filter through the stained glass windows of the music hall, casting fractured patches of color across the parquet floor. Detective Inspector Braddon stood at the center of the rehearsal room, motionless but alert, the silence pressing inward as if daring him to unravel it. He reviewed his notes not with pen, but memory. 3 figures at the center of this twisted ensemble, each with discordant motives, none yet harmonized with the truth. But something threaded them together, something sharp and hidden. Like a dissonant chord buried in a symphony, Lady Chudleigh claimed grief. But grief didn't explain why she lied about the security footage. A deeper motive swirled beneath her polished demeanor. Not money, her wealth was well established. Not artistic jealousy, she'd long given up performance. But love, perhaps, or revenge twisted by time. Her history with Arthur Grange was no secret. Yet no one knew precisely how it had ended. If he had rejected her, or worse, humiliated her, could this vanishing act be an orchestration of her own? Vincent Lee was the most transparent, and that made him suspect in a different way. His ambition clung to him like resin. He reeked of it. His entire career balanced on Grange's absence, the opening of a void he might fill. And yet, would he risk being caught so early in his rise? No, not unless someone promised him protection, or a share, or perhaps, unless he was playing a part in someone else's plan, unwittingly, a pawn disguised as a prodigy. And Hargrove, the weakest of the 3, and yet the gatekeeper to all that moved through the hall. He could be bribed, threatened, used. His motives were likely practical money, perhaps, or fear, if he accepted the crate without checking it. Someone knew he would. That kind of assumption comes from experience or leverage. Braddon stepped into the small lounge near the dressing rooms where Lee was now seated again, cup of untouched tea cooling beside him. "I've been thinking," Braddon said without preamble, "about your statement." Lee looked up, wary. "I already told you everything." "Indeed. You told me Arthur packed his violin into the case after rehearsal. But there's something odd about that. There was no trace of rosin powder or fresh tuning grease in the case interior. The instrument wasn't freshly played when it vanished." Lee blinked. "Maybe he cleaned it. Arthur Grange, the man who insisted on rosin mid-performance? You think he delicately wiped his violin down before placing it in the case? Minutes after rehearsal? I don't know. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe," Braddon said evenly. "It wasn't in the case at all. There was a flicker in Lee's eye. Just a flicker. Which brings me to this. You arrived back at 6 to rehearse alone. Yet you never touched the stand. Not once in the footage. You stood near it. But you didn't practice. You were waiting. For who? That's what I intend to find out." He left the violist and went straight to the main foyer, where Lady Chudleigh had taken up residence, as if presiding over her private kingdom. She looked up sharply. "More questions, only one," he said, then corrected himself. "2. Why did you request the cleaning staff delay maintenance in the East Corridor for 3 days this week?" She raised an eyebrow. "I didn't. I simply noted that the corridor was not to be disturbed until after the concert. Arthur requested it. Arthur's request, written in your own hand. I often acted on his behalf. And the delivery? The one signed for Bayard Fenlow? That crate could only have entered the building if you authorized the rear doors." She didn't speak for a long time. "Then I wanted to help him disappear, to escape. The pressure, the disease." Braddon's pulse quickened. "Disease?" She hesitated, caught between discretion and guilt. "Arthur told me a month ago. Early onset. He didn't want it public. He was terrified of failing on stage. And so you smuggled in a crate large enough to contain him and the violin? Let him vanish." She gave a slow, pained nod. "It was his wish, his farewell. And the cello case? That I didn't know about." She wasn't lying. Not about that dot back in the dressing room corridor. Braddon found Hargrove once more, pacing near the mail desk, sweat now staining the collar of his shirt. "I need you to tell me everything you know about Vincent Lee's recent visits," Braddon said calmly. Hargrove swallowed. "He was always here, even on off days. Obsessed. Did he ever request access to the archives?" Hargrove hesitated. "Yes, twice this week. He said he was reviewing Grange's old performances." Braddon stared. "And did he take anything?" "I don't know. We don't keep a full inventory of what's copied. An idea formed in Braden's mind, an unsettling, elegant theory. He asked for the archive terminal again and queued up not the live security footage, but the rehearsal recordings. 3 days ago, midday. Grange seated, playing a brief, broken movement of Bach. Then a cut in the tape, slight, nearly imperceptible. When the video resumed, the man in the footage looked like Grange. Same coat, same posture, but the bowing, stiffer, more mechanical, a different man. Braden froze the image, enhanced the face. Grainy, but the angle showed just enough. Vincent Lee, in disguise, not pretending to be Grange for the audience, but practicing it, mimicking the way Arthur held himself, gestured, moved on stage. Preparing for something, Braden turned slowly. The cello case, the man seen carrying it, had Grange's build, Grange's stride, but perhaps not Grange's soul. A switch, somewhere between rehearsal and vanishing. The real Grange was taken, or went willingly, and Lee stepped into his place, long enough to slip away unseen. A web of motives: Chudley's compassion, Hargreaves' complicity, Lee's ambition. But only one truth could make it all work. Braden now saw it. Arthur Grange had planned his exit, but someone else had used that plan for their own end. And that meant the violin was still here, hidden, waiting to sing. The next morning dawned with a forced sense of triumph. Reporters clustered outside the music hall gates, their voices rising over each other in a fever of speculation. The word had spread quickly. Vincent Lee, the brilliant but volatile understudy, had been taken into custody late the previous evening. He hadn't resisted. In fact, he seemed oddly prepared for it. The official story, pushed forward by the superintendent and lapped up eagerly by the press, was neat, plausible, and deeply flawed. Lee had impersonated Grange, rehearsed. The movements mimicked the mannerisms, even slipped on the maestro's coat. Using the confusion of the post-rehearsal hours, he had vanished with the Garnerius, concealing it in the cello case, spotted by the tramp. The motive, ambition twisted into obsession. He would never be Grange, so he removed him, not through violence, but by absence. Let the legend die, the echo could live on. Braden stood by the police van as Lee was loaded inside, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. The young man caught his eye as the door swung shut. There was something strange in the glance. Resignation, yes, but something quieter, too. Awaiting. Back in the superintendent's temporary office, Braden listened in silence as the official narrative was laid out like a polished trophy. All signs point to Lee, said Superintendent Mallory, voice flush with confidence. Footage, motive, physical resemblance. We've even found a violin-shaped imprint in his apartment wardrobe. Probably kept it hidden there before he planned to move it. Braden didn't speak immediately. He walked to the desk, picked up the supposed violin imprint photo, and studied it. A wardrobe with velvet lining, he said eventually. Convenient to convenient. That shape could belong to any instrument. Mallory stiffened. We're not throwing out the whole case because of felt patterns, no. But we are ignoring the rhythm. What rhythm? The timing, Braden said calmly. Lee may have rehearsed the role of Grange, yes. He might even have helped in the vanishing act. But if he did, he wasn't alone. And more importantly, he wasn't in control. Mallory waved a hand dismissively. The violin's gone. The man is missing. The motive fits. Braden turned, stepping closer. The violin wasn't moved through the wardrobe. The apartment had no security breach, no dust disturbed except what the officers tracked in themselves, and Lee has no vehicle, no means of moving such a high-value item alone without being noticed. You think we've got the wrong man? I think we have one of the players, Braden said quietly, but not the composer. Later that day, Braden returned to the performance chamber. He walked the empty stage, the house lights low, the echoes of rehearsals still faint in the boards. Something gnawed at him, not a missing detail, but the feeling of being led, of being shown what he expected to find. He stood where Arthur Grange always stood, center stage, spine to the audience, facing the orchestra pit. He imagined the weight of the Garnerius under his chin, the way his hand must have trembled, just slightly, preparing for the last note of his career. And then Braden turned. The acoustics of the room were known to him, but something caught his attention and off-hum. Barely audible, he moved toward the edge of the pit, descended the short steps into the orchestra trench, and crouched by the string section's riser. There, half concealed beneath a removable panel meant for power cables, was a recent scuff, a straight line, rough varnish, as if something had been dragged gently, carefully but recently. Braden stood and made a quiet request to have the pit floor opened. Within an hour, maintenance arrived. The panel came loose. A hollow space emerged. And inside it, a black cloth-wrapped object. Not the violin, but a case, a false one. Inside was a weighted dummy wooden cloth, roughly violin-shaped, heavy enough to mimic the weight of the real thing in a grab-and-go switch. Someone had staged it. Someone who knew the authorities would be watching, who had wanted the violin to be declared stolen and wanted Lee to take the fall. Braden unwrapped the cloth further. In the bottom corner was a stitched tag, Chudla Linens, custom piece, old but cared for. His eyes narrowed. He left the stage, in silence, re-entered the rehearsal chamber where Lady Chudla now sat with her personal assistant, sipping from a porcelain cup. She looked up, offered a practiced smile. "I do hope the press quiets down soon," she said lightly. "This whole thing has become very tiresome." Braden didn't return the smile. "You once said you wanted to help Arthur escape, that you respected his desire for silence." She nodded, brows raised. "Yes, and did it never occur to you that someone might use that plan for their own ends?" Her lips thinned. "Are you implying I staged this?" "No, I think you set the board, but someone else made the first move." She studied him. "And you think that someone was Vincent Lee?" "I think he was drawn in by your suggestion. But then someone else, someone with access to both Lee and your scheme, saw a way to profit. The violin's disappearance isn't just about legacy, it's about value." Her voice was quiet now. "It's not in my possession. I believe you. But you knew something was off." Her silence was admission enough. That evening, Mallory called a press briefing. The violin was officially declared missing, but likely removed prior to Grange's disappearance. The authorities congratulated themselves for an arrest, for a neat conclusion. But Braden stood by the side door, staring out at the fog creeping in from the Thames, his thoughts circling the absence. The violin had not left the building, not yet, and the person who had it had waited. The false case was too perfect, a distraction, which meant the real crime had yet to play its final note. The rain came back that night, falling in thin, unhurried lines down the music hall's stained windows, as though time itself had slowed to listen. Inspector Braden remained in his office long past the official closing of the hall. He sat alone, leaning over a map of the building's lower levels, his finger tracing the path from the rehearsal chamber to the storage tunnels, and finally to the prop cellar, where the false violin case had been discovered. It was too elegant to be impromptu. Whoever had staged the theft had known the building better than anyone else, not just its layout, but its acoustics, its shadows, which narrowed the list to only a handful of people. And yet, something in the design didn't feel professional. It wasn't the work of a seasoned thief. It was more theatrical, like a scene written years ago, only now performed. He rose and moved toward the filing cabinet tucked in the far corner. Not the official police reports, those were always tidy, often too tidy, but the personal drawer, where he kept articles, sketches, unsolved clippings. He found it quickly, though he hadn't read it in years, a yellowed folder with the title. The Niven case scrawled across the top. A violinist, a stage, a disappearance. No missing instrument, that time only a life, vanishing mid-performance. The case had gone cold before Braden joined the force, but he remembered reading about it. As a young constable, Jeremy Niven, an experimental composer and violinist, had vanished after a final rehearsal in 1987. His violin had been found in a fountain outside the concert hall, submerged and intact. The man himself had never surfaced again, but one name jumped off the page now, fresher than the rest. Hargrove. At the time, a junior stage technician. Braden stared at it. The coincidence was too exact. He retrieved the personnel files from the modern staff register and cross-referenced them. Yes, same man, now the hall's manager, promoted over time, trusted, affable. And always in the right place or the wrong one. He called up the archive again, this time looking not for performance footage, but for staff documentation records of hires and transfers. Hargrove's file was tidy, with years of steady work. But tucked in the corner of a scanned page, Braden spotted something, a notation. From 21 years ago. Temporary reassignment, Lichmere Institute. Assistive role for Community Therapy Orchestra. It meant nothing on the surface until he searched the Lichmere roster and found another name, Arthur Grange, not as a performer. As a patient, there it was. Two names, Grange and Hargrove, linked not just by music, but by silence. The same year Niven disappeared, Braden's breath left him slowly. He dug deeper. It had been whispered in obscure circles that Grange had suffered a breakdown in the 1980s. Few knew the extent of it. Lichmere was a high-end facility, discreet and quiet, and in the notes scanned by an inattentive clerk, Braden found one final, crucial detail. Jeremy Niven had also been a patient there. 3 men, 1 hospital, 1 stage, 1 vanished violinist. It wasn't theft. It was resurrection. Grange had taken Niven's legacy, his instrument, even his unfinished compositions, and built a career on them. Or had it been given to him? Braden rose again, moved through the now silent hall toward the lower archive. He turned on a single lamp and began thumbing through concert programs from 1989 onward. He wasn't looking for Grange's name, he knew those by heart. He was looking for something else. And he found it. A single composition, performed only twice in Grange's early career, and never again. Reverie for the Forgotten. The composer was credited simply as J.N. Jeremy Niven. Buried in plain sight, the final piece before he vanished. Had Grange taken it as a tribute or a theft? Braden went to the practice room and pulled a recording of that exact concert from the archives. It was a poor copy, warped by age, but the final 5 minutes held something disturbing. As Grange played, the tempo slowed. The melody dissolved into silence, not an artistic pause, but something unnatural, like a memory trying to return. As the audience coughed and shuffled, the violin's voice thinned, and then stopped. No applause. The tape ended without closure. Back, upstairs, Braden found Hargrove still in the administrative office, sorting through forms with too much purpose. "Mr. Hargrove," Braden said quietly, "do you remember Jeremy Niven?" The manager's hands froze. "I read about him," he said slowly. "A long time ago. You worked the stage that night." Hargrove didn't speak. "I found your Lichmere file," Braden continued. "You met Arthur Grange there, just after Niven vanished. I never lied about it. You never mentioned it." The silence tightened. "Did you help Grange rebuild his career using Niven's work?" "It wasn't like that," Hargrove said, voice low. "Arthur didn't steal anything. Jeremy was lost, brilliant, but erratic. He'd written things he couldn't finish. He gave them to Arthur. And then he went into the water. He wanted to vanish, said he couldn't be what the world wanted, and Arthur stepped in. He made the music live." Braden nodded slowly. "Until now, you don't understand." Hargrove whispered, "This was never about the violin. It was about guilt." Braden studied him. "Whose?" But Hargrove wouldn't say more. And still, the violin was missing. Not in Lee's flat. Not in Chudley's hands. Not in the false case. It was hidden somewhere. Arthur would return for it. Braden stood, walking slowly out into the empty corridor. Again, he passed the portrait gallery, then stopped. One of the paintings had a duller frame recently touched. He leaned in, then stepped back and lifted it gently from the wall. Behind it, a small recessed alcove. Inside, a black case, aged but perfect, the Garnerius. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The silence said everything. It was waiting, not to be played by Vincent Lee, not displayed by Lady Chudla, not sold or broken or claimed, but returned, because somewhere, Arthur Grange, if he was still Arthur Grange, was out there, carrying someone else's name, living someone else's echo, and perhaps, finally, hearing the sound of his own silence. Braden left the hidden alcove untouched. The Garnerius rested inside its case like a sleeping relic, sacred in its stillness, untouched by the chaos above. He closed the panel carefully and returned the portrait to its mount. Now was not the time to remove it. Not yet. Instead, he stepped back into the corridor, letting his thoughts sharpen. The case had never truly been about theft. It was about legacy, identity, and guilt, layered like dust upon the shoulders of every suspect. Yet guilt could be quiet, slow to surface, easy to disguise. What he needed now was something that couldn't be staged, a method that would reach past the careful masks each player had constructed. Something personal, uncontrolled. He found it in music. That afternoon, Braden arranged a small gathering in the rehearsal chamber, under the pretext of clarifying the official record. The invitation was delivered to Vincent Lee, released, temporarily under supervision, to Lady Chudleigh, who arrived with her habitual grace and black veil, and to Hargrove, whose discomfort had begun curdling into fear. No mention was made of the violin's discovery. They arrived to find a single chair placed at the center of the stage, a battered practice instrument resting beside it on the floor. Nothing valuable, no audience, just the echoing hush of the empty hall. "I'd like to try something," Braden said, voice low but firm. "Each of you has claimed, in some way, to have acted in Arthur Grange's interest, perhaps even in his name. Today, I want to hear. How well you knew him." Lee blinked. "You want us to what? Play?" "Yes," Braden said. "Just one piece, Reverie for the Forgotten." A ripple passed through them. "No one's played that in years," Chudleigh murmured. "You all know it," Braden replied, "or knew someone who did." He picked up the sheet music and handed it to Lee first. "You go first." The violist hesitated, glancing at the others. "It's not written for my instrument." "No, but you've studied Grange. You said once you could mimic his style. I want to see it." With stiff limbs, Lee moved to the chair and took up the instrument. He tuned in silence, then placed the bow. The first notes were closed, technically clean. The melody intact, but the phrasing was wrong, mechanical, calculated. He was trying to play as Grange might have played, not as Grange had felt. Each measure was an imitation, a mask in sound. When he finished, Braden said nothing. He took the violin back, offered it to Lady Chudleigh. She raised both hands, almost in defense. "I haven't played in 20 years. Just try," Braden said gently. She did. Her bow trembled. The notes broke halfway through the first line. She stopped, lowered the instrument, and sat down again, without a word. Then Braden turned to Hargrove. He hesitated. "I don't play." "No," Braden said. "But you were there. You watched them both, Grange and Niven. You tuned their instruments, cleaned their strings, set their stands. You know this music more intimately than anyone here." He held the violin out. Hargrove stared at it, eyes wide, then stepped forward, almost reluctantly, and sat. For a long moment, he didn't play. Then he began. It was clumsy. Yes, he was no virtuoso, but the phrasing was right. The pauses were placed where Grange had always hesitated. The tempo shift in the third movement matched the 1989 recording precisely. Even the final, trembling glissando was familiar. It wasn't a performance, it was a memory. When the last note faded, Braden didn't move. He simply said, "You were there when it was written." Hargrove looked at him, color draining from his face. I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do. This piece wasn't Arthur's. It wasn't even Niven's, not entirely. You composed sections, didn't you? You helped them fit together. You worked on it with them at Lichmere. Jeremy started it, but it was a trio: Niven, Grange, and you. No, you used to hum that third measure while adjusting stage lights. I've seen you do it. You knew it in your bones." The silence deepened. Then Hargrove exhaled, long and shaking. It was never supposed to come out. Braden waited. "I helped shape parts," Hargrove admitted. "Back then, at Lichmere. It was the only thing that kept any of us sane. Jeremy was brilliant, but fragmented. Arthur could finish things, but lacked the spark. I bridged them, helped fit it together. But I was no one. I didn't want credit, just to hear it played." But when Niven vanished, Braden said, "Grange took the music. He tried not to. He buried Reverie, only performed it twice, but the guilt gnawed at him. And then you brought it back." Braden said, "This whole vanishing act, it wasn't just Grange's plan to disappear. It was yours. Your idea to use the crate, to lay the false trail. I didn't want Lee blamed, Hargrove said, bitterly. But it spiraled. And the violin, I told Arthur where to hide it, so he could come back if he chose, or let it be found and remembered. Braddon nodded, slowly. He walked to the portrait on the hallway wall and opened the hidden panel once again, revealing the Garnerius, waiting still. Lady Chudleigh gasped. Vincent Lee stepped forward, eyes wide, as if seeing a ghost. But Hargrove, only close his eyes. You still have a choice, Braddon said quietly. To be remembered in silence, or come forward and let the music tell the rest. Outside, the rain began to lift, and somewhere, not far off, the wind carried a melody that none of them had heard in years, but all of them knew by heart. The Garnerius was no longer safe. That realization struck Braddon the moment he stepped out of the practice chamber and saw the angle of the portrait had shifted again, barely half a degree, but enough. Someone had returned to the alcove, and someone had touched it. The detective moved quickly, heart suddenly cold with urgency. He peeled back the portrait, fingers tense. The hidden panel hung open. The violin was gone. He stared at the empty recess for a long time, trying to absorb the weight of its absence. There had been no sound, no alarm, no witnesses, and yet it had vanished as perfectly as Grange himself. It wasn't public knowledge. Only for people had known about the alcove, Braddon, Hargrove, Chudleigh, and Lee, none of whom should have had the chance or motive to act in that short window, unless someone had never left the building. He retraced his steps methodically, but found nothing, no prints, no scuffs, no forced locks. The corridor was undisturbed, the door hinges oiled, the air to still. Whoever had taken it had done so with precision. Not just a thief, but a guardian of secrets. Back in the office, he scanned the key logs, no entries. But that meant little. Most of the inner staff had bypass access. A call came from Mallory an hour later. The rehearsal room had been entered during the early hours. The temporary security system had experienced a glitch, no recording, no alarm. To perfect. Sabotage. And the case, once again, began to slip from under him. He summoned the three central figures once more, Lee, Hargrove, Chudleigh, and laid the news before them. None spoke at first. Then Lee shook his head in disbelief. I didn't even know you'd found it. Braddon said nothing. Lady Chudleigh's expression faltered, then tightened. You should have told me the moment it was recovered. I could have arranged, you could have alerted someone, Braddon said flatly. Which is exactly what I was trying to avoid. She turned her eyes away, lips pale. Hargrove sat very still, as if the weight of the vanished violin had fallen directly on his chest. I checked the panel this morning, he said slowly. I swear it was untouched. It must have happened between 9 and 10. Braddon nodded. While the building was open, while we were all here. A long pause stretched between them. I want to see the basement, he said finally. Now they took the narrow stairwell down past the old prop rooms into the underbelly of the building. The foundation levels were mostly unused, occasional storage, pipes, rusted stands, but Braddon was counting on that. Obscurity, forgotten paths. The last room at the far end was a tuning vault once used to temper string acoustics in extreme humidity. Now abandoned. He stepped in and found something chilling. An empty violin stand, perfectly upright. And beside it, a single string, snapped, curled like a spider's leg. Not from the Garnerius, but newer, synthetic. The stand was a signal, a warning. He turned to Hargrove, who had gone suddenly pale. This was your idea, Braddon said quietly, to leave it in the alcove, to give him a chance to come back. You were counting on that. I didn't, he faltered. I told Arthur how to hide it, but I didn't know when he'd return, or if someone got here first. Lee was pacing now. Then he has come back. Grange, he took it himself. The violin is his. No, Braddon said. Grange would have left a sign, a message. He wouldn't have erased it, and he certainly wouldn't have gone through this trouble to keep it buried. Lady Chudleigh suddenly spoke, voice rougher than before. What if he's dead? The others froze. She continued. What if someone silenced him years ago? What if this entire vanishing act was planned without him? Hargrove says Grange was tormented by guilt. But what if someone else used that torment, turned it? Her eyes settled on Lee. I was in love with Arthur once, she said softly. He left me when the music started to consume him, he told me. He didn't know if he was playing his own music anymore. He was afraid someone had written it through him. That doesn't make sense, Lee snapped. It does, Braden said. If someone was ghostwriting his legacy. The room seemed to darken, even as the fluorescence above flickered. Someone who helped create Grange's sound. Braden continued. Someone who stood in the wings all these years. Not just Hargrove. He turned slowly. Vincent, what else have you been copying? Lee's face twitched. Excuse me, you mimicked Grange's posture, his bow technique, even his stage gait. That wasn't ambition, that was study. Almost ritualistic. I admired him. You prepared for him. A beat. Then Lee's voice dropped. You think I'm trying to be him. I think you're the only person who knew how to replace him. No one spoke. The single string on the floor caught the light like a warning flare. Lee turned, stepping out into the corridor, but Braden didn't stop him. He'd seen what he needed. A tremor in Lee's wrist, barely perceptible, but present. A musician's nightmare nerve degradation. If Grange had truly vanished, Lee wouldn't have played Reverie with such control days ago. But now he trembled, not with guilt, with desperation. Because someone else had stolen what he thought belonged to him. And now the violin was gone. Again. They returned to the main level in tense silence. But as they reached the rehearsal room, one of the junior assistants ran to meet them, breathless. Inspector, there's something in the music library. Braden followed at once. Inside, between 2 volumes of Paganini, lay an envelope, plain, cream-colored, sealed with red wax and marked. Save for a single phrase in Grange's precise handwriting, the final note always echoes. Inside, a cassette tape, old, labeled in pen. Fenlo, December 1987. Braden turned it over in his hands. Fenlo. The name that had begun this whole journey. Someone had just reached backward into the shadows of the past and tossed the truth forward right before snatching it away again. The stakes had changed. The game was no longer about guilt or memory. Now it was about possession. And someone was willing to erase anything that stood in their way. The cassette tape lay on the table between them like a talisman of forgotten truth. Braden stared at the label Fenlo, December 1987, as if it might whisper answers without being played. The music library was still, the fluorescent light above humming with quiet insistence. He didn't trust the tape outside controlled conditions. Whatever secrets it held had survived nearly for decades in silence. Another hour wouldn't change its contents, but exposure might destroy them. Carefully, he placed it in a protective pouch and slipped it into his coat. For now, it was safer with him than anywhere in the building. As he left the library, he passed Hargrove near the stairwell. The man looked drawn and older than he had 2 days ago. Guilt aged the face faster than years, and Hargrove now carried enough for 3 lifetimes. Someone's working against us, Braden said, quietly, and they're inside. Hargrove nodded without asking for proof. You think it's Lee? I think Lee thinks he's in control, but someone else is holding the bow. He barely made it 10 steps down the corridor when the alarm shrieked to life. It wasn't the main entrance alarm, nor the auxiliary sensors that covered the violin alcove. It was from the basement, the old loading lift. Braden turned and ran, the narrow corridor blurring as his shoes struck the tiled floor. By the time he reached the stairwell, 2 constables had already gathered at the upper landing, radios crackling. Movement in the east tunnel, one said, breath tight. We thought it was a rat at first, but there's blood on the floor. Braden didn't hesitate. He descended quickly, heart pounding, the back of his neck prickling with the sick anticipation he'd learned to trust over 20 years. In the field, at the tunnel's end, just past the disused dressing rooms, they found him, Vincent Lee, face down. Blood smeared down one arm, pooling at the base of his head where it had struck the cement. A smashed metronome lay near his shoulder, its bell cracked, ticking irregularly. The air was sharp with iron. Alive, a medic said, checking his pulse. Concussion, possibly more. Don't move him yet, Braden said. He crouched by the man's head, examining the wound. Blunt force. No weapon nearby except the broken metronome that wasn't heavy enough, which meant he'd been hit elsewhere and dragged here. But why him? Unless he'd found something he wasn't supposed to. A shuffle of cloth caught Braden's attention. The corner of Lee's coat had been torn. Almost surgically, something had been taken from the inner lining. A pocket, empty, slashed. "Check his rooms," Braden ordered. "Now. And get a fingerprint team down here, quietly, back upstairs." Lady Chudless stood at the entrance to the rehearsal hall, eyes wide and unfocused. "I heard someone shouting," she said. "What happened?" Braden didn't answer. He studied her a moment, her tight grip on the velvet glove, the rigid set of her shoulders. "Where were you just now?" "In the library. I was looking for old programs, Arthur's early work." Her voice was steady, too steady. Braden glanced toward the mezzanine. "No one saw you leave." "I didn't realize I was being watched." "You always are," Braden said quietly. She flinched. He moved toward Lee's temporary lodging next, accompanied by a constable and a staff archivist. The room was sparse, monkish. Sheet music lined the desk in chaotic stacks, a bow resting across them like a makeshift paperweight. A crumpled note lay by the wastebasket. "If I disappear again, it won't be someone else's masterpiece this time." No signature, but the letterhead was unmistakable, from the Lichmere Institute. The edges were smeared, but the meaning was chilling. Lee had been in contact with the same place where Niven and Grange had once vanished into silence. He wasn't just imitating the past. He was trying to rewrite it. Braden turned to the constable. "Send someone to Lichmere. I want their intake files for the last 6 months, staff and patient. Anyone connected to Lee, Grange, or the Niven case, sir." He stayed in the room for a moment after they left, gaze lingering on the sheet music. Scribbled in the margins of a half-completed score was a single phrase. "The third movement folds inward, not outward. That's where the echo breaks." He copied it into his notebook. Back at the station, he had the cassette tape digitized by the lab's old audio technician, a man who still remembered real decks and magnetic hiss. The process took hours. When it finally played, the recording was faint but discernible, a private session. Niven's voice soft, melodic, outlining ideas. Grange replying, uncertain at first, then building momentum. Then a third voice, harder to identify, calm, authoritative. "No one remembers the second violin, Arthur," it said. "Only the first. If you want to survive, you'll have to become the echo." The tape warped then, a glitch. But Braden knew that voice. Hargrove. And with it came another truth. Grange hadn't stolen Niven's legacy out of ambition. He had been persuaded to do it, guided, molded. Possessed. Bredon leaned back, the pieces shifting violently in his mind. Lee hadn't been the original puppet. He was just the next one. Someone, maybe Hargrove, maybe someone higher, had been shaping careers from the shadows. For decades, building echoes of lost musicians, turning madness into mythology. And now the Garnerias was gone. Lee was unconscious, and whoever had taken the violin knew exactly what it meant to the next stage of the performance. This wasn't the final act. It was the overture to something darker. Braden felt it now, a deep unease rising inside him. He wasn't just chasing a crime anymore. He was standing inside a story that someone else had written, and unless he could flip the page before the next note fell, someone else would vanish. The snow had started, fine and dry, drifting through the gaps above the rehearsal hall's upper windows like forgotten dust. Braden sat alone in the manager's office, lights dimmed, the cassette player humming a low static between plays. He'd listened to the tape 6 times now. Each time, he heard something new, a breath, a pause, a slight shift in tone. When Hargrove's voice guided Arthur's, "Become the echo," Hargrove had said. But it wasn't just metaphor. It was instruction. Braden rubbed his temple, feeling the fatigue mount behind his eyes. Lee was still unconscious in hospital, his pockets empty, and his mind likely scrambled if he ever woke. The Garnerias was still gone. The past, Niven's life, Grange's silence, Hargrove's role lay in fractured, looping sentences on the desk before him, and yet something itched at him, not the evidence, but something smaller, a whisper he couldn't place, an oddity he had dismissed. He reached for his notebook and flipped back to his original notes, witness testimonies, collected statements, the day of the violin's disappearance. That was it. He found the passage. Lady Chudless, after the rehearsal. He always touched the bust of Handel before a performance. Said it helped him center his breath. At the time, Braddon had brushed it off as a charming superstition, but now the memory sharpened. Grange had performed in the same hall for nearly 30 years. If he had such a ritual, it would have left a mark grease, wear, discoloration. And yet, when Braddon had walked that corridor weeks ago, the bronze of Handel had gleamed like it had been polished, which meant someone had cleaned it recently or used it recently. He stood abruptly and made for the main corridor, crossing through the echoing silence of the hall until he reached the marble pedestal. The bust sat, as it always had, beneath the second-floor mezzanine arch. Braddon stepped closer and examined the surface. The metal bore faint scratches across the back half-moon, arcs too clean to be natural. Not where movement. He ran his hand behind the pedestal and felt something click. The pedestal shifted. Inside, a hidden compartment, narrow, shallow. Empty. But the dust pattern revealed its recent use. He checked for fibers. There was something wool, threaded with deep green, velvet, a glove lining. Lady Chudla. He checked the adjoining corridor's security feed. It hadn't recorded anything unusual, but the timestamp near the violin's second disappearance matched a blackout period logged manually. From the admin terminal, 5 minutes. He returned to her office and began scanning everything anew. The first 2 drawers were locked. He picked them easily, letters, old invitations, but the third, a false bottom. Inside, a single photograph, undated, faded. Arthur Grange, younger, but not alone. Jeremy Niven stood beside him, eyes alight with manic energy, and behind them, barely visible, was a third man, not Hargrove. Braddon froze. It was Grange's twin. He stared at the photo, heart racing. The resemblance was uncanny. Same height, same jawline, same intensity, but the eyes were colder, flatter. The twin had never been mentioned in any public record. Not once. He flipped the photo. In thin pencil, one name had been scribbled. Alden. He pulled every archive file from the Fenlow recordings, from the Lichmere registry, from Grange's earliest performances. There was no Alden Grange anywhere. It was as if he had been erased, or never formally existed. Until now, the tapes made sense. It hadn't been Hargrove manipulating Grange from the start. It had been Alden. The man behind the curtain, the one who never stood on stage. Alden had written with Niven, let Arthur take the spotlight. And when Niven cracked, Alden had shaped Arthur's guilt into genius, coaching him. Using Hargrove as a mouthpiece, they'd constructed the myth together. But when Arthur wanted silence, Alden must have seen it as betrayal. He didn't want his brother to vanish. He wanted him to remain as an echo. So he created another, Vincent Lee. Braddon stood slowly, the weight of realization folding over him. Everything had been orchestrated, not just the theft, but the performances, the guilt, the vanishing. And now Alden was finishing the composition he had started 30 years ago. Braddon reached again for the cassette tape, skipping to the last 30 seconds. Grange's voice was almost inaudible, but the words were there if you strained. I don't want to do this anymore. Let it die. Let him die. Then Alden's voice, perfectly calm. There's no death in music, Arthur, only rest. The cassette clicked off. The storm outside thickened. Wind howled against the music hall's ancient panes. Braddon turned toward the upper wings. If Alden had returned, if he'd ever left, he would be close. Somewhere hidden, somewhere with acoustics, with silence. He made for the upper tuning chambers, just beyond the rehearsal dome. And there, he found the door cracked open. Inside, a room bare but for one thing, the Garnerias, resting on its stand, as though nothing had ever happened. And seated beside it, hands folded in his lap, was a man who looked precisely like Arthur Grange, but older. Colder. A mirror with no soul. Alden. Braddon said softly. The man didn't move. You never wanted to be seen, did you? Braddon continued. Just heard. That's why you let Arthur play. That's why you let Vincent study him. Alden finally turned. His voice was soft. Echoes are always more beautiful than the original. They're cleaner, refined. Braddon took a step closer, but the echo fades eventually. The real note remains. Alden smiled faintly. That's why I wrote a new ending. Then he stood. No weapon, no threat. Just an aging composer with too much silence inside. Braddon didn't reach for cuffs, not yet. He simply said, "The performance is over, Alden." And for the first time in 30 years, the man who had written from the shadows nodded almost with relief. Alden didn't resist. When Braddon led him from the tuning chamber, the man walked with the easy grace of someone who had spent his life controlling tempo, not under it. His gaze didn't dart nervously or seek escape. He moved as if every moment had already been written, and he was simply turning the page. They reached the small interview room in the basement, where time seemed to stretch long between the walls. Braddon poured 2 cups of lukewarm tea, left one untouched in front of Alden, and sat opposite him, notebook closed, tape recorder on. Alden leaned back, fingers tapping an invisible rhythm on the chair arm. "You already know what I did," he said softly. "You've pieced together the structure, but I don't think you understand why." Braddon didn't answer immediately. He let the silence do its work. When it settled like dust in the air, Alden continued. "Arthur wasn't supposed to be the one on stage. That was never the plan. He was my reflection. Yes, but only a mirror, not a light. I wrote. I studied. I composed from childhood. Our mother taught us both, but I absorbed it." He mimicked it. There was no malice in his tone, no anger, only the clinical detachment of a man dissecting his own shadow. But he was beautiful, Alden said. Audiences loved him, not because of what he played but because of who they thought he was, the tortured prodigy, the soulful recluse. They called him the human lament. He chuckled faintly, but those weren't his sorrows they heard. They were mine. Braddon frowned. "You gave him your work willingly." "I lent it," Alden said with an edge. "He begged me that first year out of Lichmere. He was terrified to fail, just until I find my own voice," he said. "But he never looked for it. He played my pieces as if they were confessions, and the world applauded. And when you wanted it back," Braddon asked. Alden's fingers stilled. "He refused, said it would ruin his reputation, said he'd earned the sound through suffering." "And did he suffer?" "Oh yes," Alden said with a grim smile, "because guilt is its own kind of talent. He tried to undo it, retired early, refused to speak to the press, went silent. But it wasn't for me. It was penance for himself, for being too weak to admit the truth." "So you erased him?" Alden tilted his head. "No, I wrote him out." He reached into his coat slowly, and Braddon tensed, but Alden only withdrew a notebook. Leather-bound, ancient with use. He placed it gently on the table. "My original manuscripts. Every measure, every phrase, not just the Garneria's pieces, but the entire canon attributed to Arthur Grange." Braddon opened the book. The handwriting matched the annotations on the old Fenlo tapes, the ones Niven had used. The compositional style was unmistakable. "You intended to reveal this?" Alden shook his head. "Not to the public, just to him. Arthur, I wanted him to hear it, alone, and know it had always belonged to someone else, that the man the world applauded had lived a borrowed life." Braddon leaned forward slightly. "But Arthur disappeared before you could confront him." "I confronted him," Alden said, voice quiet. "The night he vanished." He looked at the wall. Eyes narrowed. "I gave him the notebook. Told him the echo had lasted long enough. I expected rage, or shame. But do you know what he said?" Braddon shook his head. He smiled. Alden whispered. He said, "Then we were both part of the same song." He closed his eyes. "It should have satisfied me, but it didn't. So you buried the violin, hid the evidence, and started grooming Lee." "I didn't groom him," Alden snapped. "He was already chasing ghosts. I simply gave him the sheet music. And when he grew unstable, I took it back." Braddon watched him closely now. "That's what happened in the basement." Alden didn't answer, but his silence was a confession. "You were afraid he'd ruin your ending. He was the ending." Alden murmured, "The final echo." But he rushed it, played too soon, and like every echo, he distorted. Braddon let the silence hold for a moment longer. Then he said, "It was never about fame, no. Or money, no. It was about authorship." Alden nodded. "Because if I didn't claim it, I never existed." Arthur was the name they remembered. Arthur was the one they mourned, but I was the one who suffered, the one who created. The notebook between them felt heavier now, not just a ledger of notes, but a record of identity, of obsession, of a life unlived in public, shaped entirely in the wings. Braddon looked up at him. So you erased him in return. Alden's expression was unreadable. I gave him rest. And in the end, that's more than he gave me. The wind howled against the building again, rattling the old pane in the ceiling. I'll see to it the truth comes out, Braddon said. Not just about the music. About you. About all of it. Alden offered a weary smile. Then maybe this time, the echo will be mine. He folded his hands as the constables entered. And for the first time, Braddon saw it the true shape of the crime, not a theft, not a murder, but a correction. One man's lifelong effort to compose himself into the world's memory, before silence claimed him for good. The rain came down in sheets as dusk fell over the city, painting the windows of the conservatory in blurred, watercolor streaks. Inside the grand hall, empty chairs stood in regimented silence beneath the chandeliers, and the stage a place of ovation, ambition. Collapse was once again set. Braddon had chosen this location for a reason. The acoustics, they revealed what people tried to conceal, a breath too quick, a hesitation too sharp, a tremor in a voice that could mask guilt but not truth. Alden had been taken into custody the day before, and the manuscript secured under lock and armed surveillance. Every page was being catalogued now. The Garnerius was back under protective vaulting, but Braddon knew it wasn't over. Something still rang false in the final chord. Alden's confession had been compelling, detailed, surgical but too perfect, too clean. It closed the case like a well-timed curtain drop. And Braddon had never trusted clean endings. Not in music. Certainly not in murder. Now he stood in the wings of the rehearsal stage, listening. Footsteps. Slow. Cautious. Lady Chudleigh entered through the rear gallery, her heels sharp on the marble. She wore deep plum, the color of dried petals, and carried a slim umbrella, though the rain was already soaking her hem. She moved toward the edge of the stage with familiar grace, pausing before the conductor's stand. You summoned me here, she said without turning. Not the police, not Hargrove. You. I thought you deserved a final performance, Braddon replied. Stepping out from the shadows, she looked over her shoulder, calm as ever. Has Alden changed his story? No, Braddon said. But I've changed my interpretation. She tilted her head. Then I must have left quite the impression. You did, he said, circling the pit, slow and methodical. You told me once that Arthur touched the handle bust before every performance. That's what made me go back and look at it again. She raised an eyebrow. Someone used that pedestal recently. Not Arthur, and not Alden. He stopped near center stage. The thread I found inside matched the lining of your glove. Lady Chudleigh gave a delicate, almost indulgent smile. You have quite the ear for detail. It's not the first time you've manipulated narratives, Braddon continued. You helped construct Arthur's mythos, fed the media his silences, his eccentricities. You ghostwrote the persona, just as Alden ghostwrote the music. She didn't deny it, only watched him with the sharpness of a seasoned audience. But here's what you didn't account for, he said, lowering his voice. Alden's obsession was legacy, but yours was always proximity. You didn't want to be remembered. You wanted to be indispensable. You're reaching, she said, softly but with steel. No, Braddon said, I'm composing. He stepped toward her, measured, unwavering. Grange didn't vanish because Alden forced him out. He vanished because you warned him what Alden was becoming. And then, when Arthur tried to walk away clean, you helped hide him. You planted the Garnerius in the alcove yourself. You made sure someone would find it just as the myth began to slip. You wanted the mystery reignited. I preserved what mattered, she said coolly. You preserved your place in it. She didn't blink. The violin was being mishandled. By fools. Lee didn't deserve it. Hargrove was past his prime. And Alden was mad with bitterness. You had Lee attacked, Braddon said. She didn't answer. It was you who slit the lining of his coat. Not to steal the manuscript, Alden already had that, but to stop Lee from becoming too central. Too noisy. You wanted to control. Who closed the story? You forget what I've seen, she whispered. Men who played like gods, and men who bled like animals. You think any of this could have lasted without me tying it together? He stepped closer. You're right. I think you were the glue. But glue that holds too tightly becomes a noose. A muscle in her cheek twitched. I can't prove the attack on Lee, Braden said. He won't remember. The cameras were cut. But I can prove the manuscript's chain of custody. You handled it before it was planted. Your fingerprints are on the cover page. But Alden told me he sealed it in 1987. She went still. I think you altered it. Just enough to ensure. Alden appeared as the architect, the echo, the villain, while you walked away clean. Her voice dropped to a hush. You think I framed him. I think you finished what Alden began. But instead of trying to be remembered, you tried to control who would forget. She laughed then. Low, bitter. I loved Arthur. I loved what he became. I made him. I shaped every ghost note that held him together after Niven died. And you think I'd let Alden, the one who fed that torment, erase everything Arthur was? I think, Braden said gently, you couldn't bear to see Arthur reduced to Alden's footnote. So you buried the last of the truth and made Alden believe it was his idea. A long silence passed between them, filled only by the hiss of rain on the rooftop. Then she walked to the Garnerius, resting quietly on its stand at the front of the stage. She ran a single-gloved finger across its neck. I never lied, she said. I just tuned the story. Braden didn't stop her as she stood for a moment longer, eyes unfocused. Then she turned and walked down the steps toward him. You've composed your ending, she said quietly. I hope the audience applauds. They usually don't, he replied. She nodded once, then extended her wrists. No drama. No screams. No last move. Just a closing note, soft and inevitable. As the constables entered from the side wings, Braden turned and looked out over the empty seats. The story was complete, but the silence afterward, the kind that holds its breath, was the loudest sound he'd ever heard. The hall had been cleared. The stage lights dimmed to a gentle amber glow. Rain clung to the high windows like a veil, casting ripples of shadow across the Garnerius, now sealed once more behind security glass. Outside, the patrol cars whispered away on wet wheels, and the echo of footsteps faded from the marble floors. Braden remained. He stood near the conductor's dais, staring at the instrument with a strange stillness, the kind that comes not after a storm but just before the aftershock. Everything was in its place. Lady Chudleigh had confessed, or at least conceded, in that practiced aristocratic way of admitting without admitting. Alden was in custody, subdued, if not entirely remorseful. The manuscript was authenticated, the motivations catalogued, the scandal soon to unfurl in national press with headlines sharp as razors. The conservatory was already whispering about restructuring, reparations, redictions. And yet, something in Braden's chest remained unsettled. It wasn't the conclusion, it was the neatness of it. He'd chased enough ghosts in his career to know that real resolutions never arrived tied with satin bows. Someone always slipped through, or something stayed unanswered. But this was too much like a composition written for audience applause. He replayed the last 48 hours in his mind, every note, every line, every pause, and then he remembered the tape. Not the one they'd digitized, but the second one, mentioned in passing by the audio technician. It came from the same box as the Fenlo tape. The man had said absently, but it was blank, or maybe overwritten. It hummed but had no track markers. Braden hadn't followed up then. The chaos had surged too quickly, but now he was already dialing. 10 minutes later, he was at the lab. The technician greeted him with an apologetic shrug. Still have it in the drawer. No label, no audio markers, nothing audible when I ran a basic scan. I figured it was degraded. Try again, Braden said. Run it slower, strip the outer layer. The man obliged, setting the tape onto a deck with finer grain analysis. For a minute, nothing. Then a sound, not music, not speech. Click, click, click. 3 deliberate taps. Silence. Then a whisper, fractured and slowed beyond recognition. The technician adjusted pitch. The words clarified. Arthur didn't burn it. Braden leaned in, heart knocking against his ribs. He hid the original I only gave her the copy." The voice was unmistakable. Alden. And the date stamp on the recording, 2 weeks ago, after Lady Chudley's first visit to the conservatory. Following her absence abroad, Braddon's breath caught. Alden had lied. Not entirely, but enough. He hadn't just been a bitter genius eclipsed by a brother. He hadn't simply tried to reclaim authorship. He had orchestrated every player. Lady Chudley was never his partner in manipulation. She was his instrument. He'd staged the thefts, planted the myths, and let her believe she was guiding the narrative. He knew her obsessions, her fear of vanishing into irrelevance. He gave her the illusion of control, fed her just enough truth to make her believe the deception was hers. She confessed because the story fit her, but she'd only ever been the final echo. Alden was still conducting. Braddon stood slowly, feeling. The chill returned to the room. He returned to the holding cells just past midnight. The officer on duty hesitated, but let him through. Alden sat in the visitor room, calm, reading a weathered copy of Bach, The Silent Notes. He looked up and smiled faintly. Couldn't sleep. "Inspector," Braddon placed the cassette on the table between them. "I found the real manuscript," he said. "Not the one you handed over, the one you buried." Alden's face didn't change. Braddon leaned forward. "Arthur's annotations are in it. His hand, his edits, his crossouts. You didn't write those final pieces alone." A pause, then Alden tilted his head. "He asked me not to tell anyone. Arthur's dead." Alden blinked slowly, and yet his silence lives on. Braddon stood. "You manipulated everyone, even her. You wanted to be remembered not just as the genius behind the music, but as the architect of your own myth. You cast her as villain so you could emerge tragic, noble. The victim who forgave. She was a villain," Alden said evenly. "Just not the only one. You orchestrated Lee's downfall, arranged the scene in the tunnel. You even recorded your false confession to ensure the right ending would reach me. If things went wrong..." Alden didn't speak. "But here's the twist you didn't plan," Braddon said, voice hard now. "Lady Chudley kept the original notebook. She had it stashed in the base of a stage prop, a hand-carved harpsichord lid from the second act of Lament for Eurydice. We recovered it this evening. That landed." Alden's eyes flicked, for the first time, with something like panic. "And the second twist," Braddon said, "the tapes. You recorded that confession so I'd think the manipulation stopped with her. But now I know you were pulling strings from the beginning. Even Arthur's silence was choreographed. You just didn't expect him to write anything down." He leaned closer. "You lost, Alden. Not because the truth came out, but because it came out without you composing it." Alden's composure cracked. He reached for the tape. Braddon pulled it back. The constables entered. Alden stood slowly, hands trembling now. "I gave them beauty," he whispered. "No," Braddon said. "You gave them control. You dressed it in music." As the door closed behind them, Braddon felt the shift at last, that rarest of moments in a mystery, when the final note isn't triumphant, but truthful, and in that silence, the echo finally stopped. The wind was rising again, stirring leaves along the cobbled courtyard of the old conservatory. Braddon stood at the top of the stone steps, collar turned against the chill, watching the gray dawn leak slowly into the sky. The case was over now, officially. The files had been sealed, charges filed, the violin recovered and locked in a humidity-controlled vault that reeked of both reverence and bureaucracy. But Braddon's eyes weren't on the horizon. They were on the black car pulling away from the south unexit-marked. Save for the police escort behind it. Inside sat Alden Grange, the real one. No aliases now, no twin to hide behind. The man who had ghostwritten a legend, tormented a brother, ruined a rising star, and framed a woman he once called a muse. And yet he wasn't heading to trial. He was being transferred, not to prison, to a secure psychiatric facility in Yorkshire, deemed unfit to stand trial. His grasp of reality considered too fragile, too distorted by years of self-imposed isolation and genius-level delusion. The court psychiatrist had described him as an architect of identity collapse, a man who believed his manipulations were not crimes, but compositions. Lady Chudley would face charges tampering with evidence, obstruction, complicity, but hers was a softer fall. She had confessed, Publicly, tearfully, the press, ever hungry for an operatic scandal, had made her into a tragic figure of art and obsession. There were whispers of a memoir, possibly even a film. And Arthur, still no body, only the original notebook, its margins filled with annotations into Hans Arthur's, and Alden's revealing a complex creative relationship that was neither theft nor partnership, but something more tangled, more intimate. The last page contained a fragment, unfinished. I don't think I want applause anymore. Just silence. That means something. Braden lit a cigarette, though he'd quit years ago. He didn't inhale, just let it burn. Behind him, the head of the conservatory, a red-eyed man named Lister, approached with a tremble in his voice. "It's done, isn't it?" he asked. "I mean, it's finally over." Braden nodded. "Though he didn't mean it. It's as done as it's going to be. But there's no trial," Lister said. Frustration and disbelief mixing. "No punishment. There's consequence," Braden replied. "That's not the same." Lister didn't seem satisfied with that. He turned and walked back into the building. Shoulders slumped. Braden stepped down onto the gravel, crunching slowly across the courtyard toward the statue of Handel. He touched the pedestal, remembering how such a small detail and echo of routine had started to unravel it all. And now, standing in the silence Arthur had once longed for, he began to trace the case backward. The broken rosin in the rehearsal room. At first a misstep, meaningless, but now it was clear. Alden had shattered it on purpose, days before the theft, to test how closely people were watching. He wanted to know how far he could manipulate the scene without being seen. The silence in Lee's tape presumed technical failure had been engineered. A vacuum designed to be filled by projection, confusion, fear. Lady Chudley's elegant misdirection feeding the narrative, feeding Braden what he expected. But that was her trap too. Alden knew she would confess if she believed the pieces aligned. He planted just enough evidence threads in a glove, fingerprints on a page, but only to trigger her guilt. And Braden, he had been baited too, not with lies, but with half-truths designed to play to his skill, to make him believe he'd solved it just in time. Only the blank cassette had betrayed the script, a careless misstep by a man too confident in his own genius. The final movement of Alden's design was clear now, not just to reclaim authorship, but to ensure he would never be erased, either. He would be remembered as the long-suffering brother wronged by history, or as the mad genius too dangerous to understand. He won either way. And in the end, that was what unsettled Braden most. The law had caught him, but justice had hesitated. Braden walked along the back corridor one last time, past the rehearsal hall, past the echoing stairwell where Lee had nearly died, and finally to the archive room. Inside, the Fenlo tapes sat in a new, reinforced cabinet, numbered, preserved. The ghost voices of Arthur and Alden, layered forever. He pulled out the first tape and sat at the old playback station. No fancy soundboard, no enhancements. Just the raw track. Arthur's voice, hesitant, low, unsure. Alden's, firm, instructing, always one step ahead. And then Braden paused. He leaned in. On the third track, halfway through, Alden stopped playing and said, "If anyone ever listens to this, tell them I warned you. There's no such thing as silence, only noise. We haven't understood yet." The phrase struck like a chord held too long. Not a warning, a dare. He turned off the player. Later, in his final report, Braden would note, "The case is technically closed. Evidence has been recovered, offenders identified, motives established." And yet, there remains a dissonance in the final bars, a feeling that someone, somewhere, is still playing. He signed his name, left the conservatory, and stepped into the damp gray morning. Somewhere, far away from London, a piano key was pressed in an empty room. Not a melody, just one note. Held. Waiting. The street outside the conservatory was nearly empty by the time Braden stepped through the side gate, the morning sun just beginning to split the clouds. His coat hung heavy with rain and time. A few damp pages of his field notes stuck out from his satchel, and the lingering scent of old varnish from the vault still clung to his sleeves. He paused at the threshold, one hand brushing the iron gate, then turned back for a final glance at the building. The windows were dark now, silent, no music spilled out. No students rushing from class to rehearsal. Only the memory of sound remained a brittle kind of quiet. As if the building itself was holding its breath, Braddon exhaled and walked on. He crossed through Knightsbridge with the rhythm of a man trying not to think. But patterns, no matter how he tried to shake them, were bred into him. Details circled back. Connections coalesced whether he willed them to or not, and one detail wouldn't let go. The second cassette, not the one Alden had recorded, but the one discovered in Arthur's personal effects, handwritten, unlabeled, and presumed blank. It had been discarded in a drawer of the conservatory archive until Braddon insisted on its inclusion in evidence. Technicians had reviewed it and reported only a single burst of static, unintelligible. He'd skimmed the log sheet, dismissed it in the chaos that followed Lady Chudley's confession and Alden's psychiatric evaluation. But now he reached into his satchel, pulled out the old report, and flipped it open as he walked. The line was brief. Track 1, static, 0 o'clock to 0:27. Track 2, no signal, no note of the pattern. He stopped cold at the corner, the street light flickering overhead. He read the timing again. 0:7 to 7. Not a random burst of noise, not if you understood tempo. He did the math in his head. Assuming a moderate adagio, roughly 60 beats per minute, 0:27 would give exactly 27 counts. A full musical phrase if structured properly, long enough for a message if hidden in frequency shifts or rhythmic pulses or a metronome. His pulse quickened. He turned back toward the conservatory before stopping himself. No, there was nothing there now, but the tape. He'd had a copy, made a backup on a small drive in his office. He could access it, test it, not to prove guilt, not anymore. To understand. 2 hours later, seated in his cluttered study with the soundproofing foam half torn from the back wall, Braddon played the audio through a spectrograph. At first, just a low wash of static. But as he slowed the track and overlaid a second frequency map, lines began to emerge sharp, repeating, intentional. He adjusted filters. The noise wasn't random. It was coded, not in voice, not in words. In notes. F sharp, C D sharp, A. He jotted them down. At first, they meant nothing. Then he heard them again, noted, not spoken, in a fragment Arthur had written in the final notebook. A melodic motif that didn't appear in any known composition attributed to either brother. It was scribbled beside a half-finished sentence, "If anyone finds this," but the rest was torn out. And now, the same 4-note motif appeared in the cassette, static, looping in sequence. Why would Arthur encode a melody? Why hide a fragment in something made to sound broken? Unless Braddon stood suddenly, heart thudding. Arthur hadn't just vanished. He had planned his exit. The final notebook had always felt wrong, melancholy, yes, but not final. Arthur had been weary, not suicidal, and Alden, despite his manipulations, had never once claimed to see his brother's body, only that he'd disappeared. And Lady Chudley? She had never admitted to witnessing anything either. Her entire confession was based on what she believed Alden capable of, not what she saw. What if Arthur had staged his own end, left the manuscript, disappeared, hidden one final message behind in a way only someone like Braddon would ever think to decrypt? Not for glory. Not to be found, but as proof that he still existed, somewhere. The cassette ended with one last shivering note, barely audible, a harmonic overtone that could have been nothing, or the beginning of another phrase. Braddon leaned back, the ceiling fan above him casting slow, spinning shadows across his wall of cases. His tea had gone cold beside him, untouched. Somewhere in the city, Alden was sitting in a secure psychiatric room, eyes closed, playing his genius to an audience of ghosts. And Arthur might still be writing, somewhere remote, somewhere safe, somewhere where no one knew the Grange name. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years, a private friend in Interpol. With access to international border records, he didn't say much, just a name, a date, and the quiet suggestion to look for aliases attached to music licenses or conservatory faculty lists. No one else needed to know. Not yet. He closed the file slowly. The Garnerius was locked away. The conservatory would rebuild its story. Lady Chudley's memoir would hit shelves within the year, but the case wasn't done. Because a mystery didn't end with a trial. It ended with truth. And this one, it was still echoing. As he turned off the desk lamp and stepped into the hallway. A faint note played again in his mind. F sharp, C, D sharp, A for notes. A signature or a summons. He smiled. He would follow it.